let's start. Okay, well, hello everyone. Welcome all our newcomers and all our regulars. We've received a lot of new followers on our Twitter and YouTube channel. So hello newcomers and welcome back our regulars. So for the newcomers, I'm just going to read sort of briefly what the Rights Club is. So it's a self-organising initiative that provides training and raises awareness in reproducible, interpretable, open and transparent science. And we run our seminars at least every week. There may be more than once a week because we're growing in number now. And I'll quickly signpost a few things for you for upcoming talks and useful resources. So we have our joint calendar, which we've compiled and cultivated. So please do make sure that you diarise these upcoming dates, particularly the upcoming conference on the 2nd of March. I just want to quickly exit this slide and quickly point out that we're very flattered and very welcoming of a new Rights Club site that's been set up at Durham. And they actually have a talk coming up very soon on the 19th of Feb. And this will be a really interesting talk on pre-registration and registered reports. So make sure that you tune in for that. But don't worry if you can't, because I realise it's short notice and people are very busy at this time of year. You can also check out our YouTube channel where you can find all of our past content. And you can check out our Twitter page as well. This is the Wolverhampton site, but you can, if you prefer, look at our main site as well. And we try to release regular content there daily. All our slides are uploaded to our YouTube OSF page as well. And finally, there is our wonderful website where you can pretty much find everything you need to know about the Right Science Club. So I'll just return back to this slide so people can note down the upcoming talks. So a bit of housekeeping before we begin. We're hosting the talks predominantly across all sites on MS Team live events, which is kind of like a Zoom webinar, which is just a one-way streaming service. So you will see the speaker, but your only way of communicating with the speaker is through the Q&A message board, which should be found, I think, on the right-hand side, or you should see some options to toggle on the panel that should appear when you move your cursor. So you can just post your questions via the Q&A message board, and please be respectful to the speaker. They will be moderated. And please do monitor the message board, because other people might ask questions that you would want to be ask yourself, and you can just upvote them, and we will try to prioritize those that have been have the most votes. Okay, and also if you join late, don't worry. You can always pause, rewind, or fast forward the talk in real time as well, which is one of the great advantages of live events. And we also have auto subtitling as well, which I've received quite positive reviews from. So anyway, on to our main event, and I'm trying to now seamlessly transition to stop sharing. And okay, right, so on to our speaker today. We're very thrilled to have James Bartlett with us today. He's fortunate enough to be on annual leave, so he has wonderful time to be with us today, I'm sure. A nice way to enjoy his annual leave. And so James was invited by one of our co-leads, Manpal Bogle, who unfortunately couldn't make it today. So thank you, Manpal. I realise, James, I'm at a disadvantage here because the link to your bio, which I had saved somewhere, is not available to me. So this is quite annoying. So just bear with me for a second, everybody, while I just try and quickly find it. Okay, right, there we go. Sorry about that hiccup, everyone. So James completed his PhD at Coventry University on the neurocognitive mechanisms associated with addictive behaviour in daily and non-daily smokers. James is now a lecturer in psychology at Arden University, excuse me, and leads undergraduate and postgraduate modules on research methods. He specialises in quantitative research methods, and his research focuses on addictive behaviour. And all his research and resources are available in the links that have been posted on our website. Okay, so let's now move on to our speaker. So James, I'll hand the keys over to you. I can see you have shared your screen, so let me just quickly do a bit of jiggery pokery with the slides and make you, okay, so you are now in control. Thank you, James.
Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. So I'm glad to see, struggling to find it yet to see the pre-prepared niceties I paid you for. So today we're going to talk about reproducible workflows and how you can incrementally improve it in your own research. So the main motivation for today was there's this great recent paper taking the qualitative approach to exploring potential barriers to open science. And one of them was this increased exposure, this increased accountability could be a barrier. So if people have all their work out there for the world to see, someone else could come along, find a mistake, and it doesn't look very nice. So although really that should be the aim, with our work in science, make sure that there is as few mistakes as possible. Nobody likes to sort of see them, especially be highlighted. So what I'm going to do today is outline all the mistakes I've made. So for my journey is I've incorporated these things into my own workflow. What mistakes have I made? How have I learned from them? Hopefully you can see that mistakes do happen, you can learn from it, it's not the end of the world, and sort of empower you a little bit to have a go and see how it goes. It can also be quite overwhelming, so there's lots of stuff out there. There's papers published almost daily on different things you can do around open science, around difference in methods. So we're going to advocate an incremental approach. So me and Joanne Eves wrote about this in the SciPag guide, so particularly important if you're an early career researcher, being able to incrementally add one of these to every project you do. And there's this great recent paper that advocates this as well, where for each stage of the pipeline, how you can add in one at a time. Some are easy, some are a little bit more difficult, and I'll be mentioning this quite a lot through this talk because it's a great article about this. And although I love all of it's going to come across quite strongly, I'm going to try and avoid any snobbery around that. So although I do poke fun at SPSS a little bit, there are ways you can make SPSS reproducible. So more focusing on how you can focus on these sort of key principles rather than being specific to any kind of software. So for grounding this talk, reproducible workflows, your ability to precisely recreate each stage of the pipeline. So as I mentioned, there's this great paper where they talk about the whole pipeline of research and providing you tips on how you can do it, why it's important, and any potential barriers you may face in doing so. So we're going to follow this structure quite closely and talk about how you can add each one in, drawing on some of the things I've done and the kind of errors that have popped up along the way. So all the way from pre-registration, the method to use, the analysis, and getting your research out there in one way or another. So hopefully everyone's seen Hot Fuzz. What you might be thinking about why this is important. So the first reason is just in terms of scientific norms, or communal reasons for trying to improve reproducible workflow. So it's for the greater good. We'll sort of outline some of the problems of why it's been drawn to our attention, that it is an important thing to do. But then there are also selfish reasons, which are almost more important. So if you're ever doubting, should you just be doing this to make the world a better place, and the sort of fuzzy rainbow that is, really, it should always come back to your selfish approach. So there's this great tweet by Rebecca where it's about coding, but if you can't remember like your variable name after you come back from lunch, what's it going to be like in 3 months? Same applies to the whole research pipeline. Most projects last months, if not years. Some things you could forget about after you go away for lunch. Some things, say you've planned your study, you're collecting data for a couple of months and you come back, can you remember everything you've done? Once you publish it, someone asks you questions about it a year down the line. Will you remember it when you're sort of 3 or 4 projects further along? So for the actual details on this of why it's important, one of the problems we have where the incentive structures for getting jobs, moving through your degrees, is the incentive structures that we're working with really favor speed over accuracy. So when you're going for jobs, it's about the number of articles you've published, the sort of number of positions you completed after your PhD. And there's this really interesting paper where they show that it's actually how science works pretty much selects these. So if you go against the grain, it can be doing you a disservice. And there's this great talk by Richard McElrath who talks about how science has this like endeavor of amateur software development. So it has all the hallmarks of how you go about developing software, from completing it for different people. So you're working on it, your supervisor's working on it. You could have undergraduate research assistants. You've got all these cogs in the system that should be moving all in the same direction. But by the end of a project, you've got so many points of, say, working on feedback, sending one version to your supervisor, they send another one back, you send it to another co-author. There are so many points in this process that could disrupt things. And then for some individual points, for each of the key things I'm going to focus on, people have identified specific problems. So when you have pre-registration, this is great in theory, but it can also still leave flexibility, and it has this sort of marker of being important and something that's going to raise the status of the research, but it's become one of those things that you can game as well. So you can say something's pre-registered and there are still lots of problems with it. So although it's better than nothing at all and you can then spot those issues, it can still leave flexibility. If you don't include the exact materials, if you imagine you're trying to reproduce an article, if you're not basing it on the exact same materials that they use, it feeds this like hidden moderator argument. So with all the many lab studies, whenever they sort of fail to replicate a previous study, one of the arguments is like, oh, you never use the exact materials. And why is that? Because you never have access to them. So it can feed this argument of if you're not replicating the study, it's just the scapegoat of it didn't replicate because you didn't have the materials that they used. For the analysis part, statistical reporting mistakes are common. So for the key outcomes, you get significant p-values should really be non-significant. Non-significant p-values should really be significant, but funnily enough, it never turns out to be that way. It's always non-significant turning magically into significant p-values. And then finally, even if you do all this, you post open data, you help people to reproduce your results. Even with the help of the original authors, you can really struggle to reproduce these values. Even in a journal that makes open data mandatory, it can still be quite difficult. So what we're going to focus on here is for each of these stages, how can you focus on improving the reproducibility of your work? So starting with pre-registration, this is one of my favorite sort of transformations where having quite a few, looking back at it, really cringy attempts to really get to a point where it's a process that I'm happy with. So the first time I tried pre-registration was for the first study of my PhD. So it's a few years ago now. And at the time, I'd read about all the different things about reproducibility. It was a year after the big open science collaboration paper, and then really wanted to have a go at this newfangled thing of pre-registering articles. But I wrote a blog post about this. You can see the link at the bottom. A sort of year or so later, where I sort of looked back at it and highlighted how awful it was. So if you want to see some of the problems, you can read this, but essentially there's no sample size justification. I just said, I'm going to get 20 people per group, the classic justification. The first time I did it, there were pretty much no hypotheses, so kind of defeating the point of pre-registration. I did go back and update this 4 months later. So no p-hacking, but it was, I'd started collecting data, I hadn't looked at anything, but by the time I'd finished the introduction, I sort of felt confident enough to stick my neck out there and make some predictions. But that was 4 months later, so it's, yeah, not quite a pre-registration, didn't really outline the procedure, and there wasn't really a detailed data screening plan. So looking back, absolute nightmare. Although it is one of those things where if you look back and it sort of horrifies you, it shows you've advanced and worked on it. Second attempt I was more happy with. So the second study of my PhD did a power analysis, although it wasn't ideal. The sort of important thing for reproducibility was I actually forgot what I did for the power analysis. So in the pre-registration, I talked about this is the design. This is how many participants it's telling me I need. But then when I went back to write up the method section, I actually forgot all the values I inputted. So it took me a couple of days to change different parameters and finally get the results I'd written down. So that's not ideal for reproducibility, although the hypotheses were there, and looking back, still quite happy with those. And it was pretty detailed on outlining any data exclusion and the analysis plan for it. So there were some good things. It was just the power analysis that was a problem. And then the final one was the last study I did for my PhD, and that was at the point where, still looking back, pretty happy with it. So it was reproducible. So I did it in R, used our Markdown to simulate a power analysis for it. So I can still run that script now, and it will give me the same answers, so I know exactly what I did. Specific hypotheses were outlined, and I'm still happy with those. And then any exclusion criteria in the analysis plan was outlined as well. So all points being reproducible. So how I'm sort of structuring this is outlining the key things with some examples, and then providing some tips on how you can think about building it into your own workflow. So after all this, it's got to a point where I'm quite happy with my approach to pre-registration. So working from that, had no idea what I was doing, making some errors, not actually making any predictions. So it's pretty much just saying I'm going to do a project without too many other details. So one of the sort of barriers people think about pre-registration is it's going to take more time. So although it takes longer to start a project, I like to think of it as your more front-loading work, where you're thinking about how you're going to analyze the data, you're thinking about any kind of exclusion criteria. It's not you playing around working out what you're trying to do when you get hold of things. You have a much clearer plan of how you can go about it. So although it takes longer at the start, once you actually get going, everything moves a little bit more smoothly. So as I mentioned towards the start, it has become another quality marker people try and game. So there's this really interesting blog post by Wachmakers and Gronau, where they outlined a pre-registration on ego depletion. And what the authors had done, they'd sort of pre-registered it and pretty much outlined any kind of prediction. I think there's about 7 or 8 predictions that we'd outlined, and not really mentioned that in the article. So although it's a better approach and you can identify that as an issue, it's not ideal. And then there's this relatively recent article by Bakker where they talked about what you should think about when you're pre-registering an article. So they outlined that really pre-registrations were more effective when they followed this structured approach. So outlining your hypotheses, outlining your planned analyses, that kind of thing. So in response to this, one of the things that I thought was a great idea was I made a pre-registration template. So for the OSF pre-registration template, I made it in our Markdown and included it on a as a template, which is on the OSF page. And then it turns out that Frederick Aust, like the guy who has an R package for writing reproducible manuscripts in R, of course, already written one that was a lot better organized and nicely presented than mine, but you can find both of those templates on this OSF page. And they both follow this structured approach where it's this OSF pre-registration template, has all the key details you're looking for in pre-registration. And then the other thing I recommend is reading examples of pre-registrations in your specific area. So there's been some recent templates on, for example, how you can apply it to qualitative research, how you can apply it to EEG research. So try and find some use cases in your specific area. When I did it, that first attempt, which looking back is pretty horrific, didn't really have anything to go off. Like none of my supervisors or people around me had any experience in pre-registration. So I didn't really have anything to base it off. The second thing is once we've got pre-registration out of the way, we're now thinking about collecting data. And the kind of gold standard is you being able to include in the final article open data from the point that you get it. But one of the important things is that you need to get the participants' consent in order to do this. So I didn't have it for the first study I did in my PhD, but I did do it for the second too. So having it in the information sheet, explaining what you're going to be doing with the data, where it's going to be available, and then on the consent form, making sure that the participant acknowledges that that is going to be available for other researchers. So your hands are pretty much tied for existing projects. You won't be able to share raw data. So this is going to help people to verify analyses later. But what you can do, and I did my PhD at Coventry University, and the librarian there said it was fine to share summary data. So without anything identifiable, pretty much like the summary level statistics, so the mean per condition, that's fine to share. But I would recommend checking with your librarian to make sure for your institution there's nothing around that. So you can share that for people to verify your analyses. But then for new projects, what's the best approach is you being able to share the raw data. So to really capture that whole analysis pipeline of you taking it from the data you get from your participants to the final data that you perform your statistical tests on, that has to be built into the ethics process. So again, recommend checking with your librarian, as your institution might have particular guidelines around this. At Coventry, there wasn't anything set in stone, so it was pretty much on me to adapt it into the consent form and really manage the data around that. But I know other institutions, there is much more structure around this, much more guidance. Like a couple of years ago, there was like the Open Science working group, and I remember a talk at Cambridge. So for one of their neuroscience centres, they had a whole institutional support around data sharing, and people would then have to apply to access the data that would come out of different projects around there. So it might be different in your institution. But one of my favourite papers, we looked at this concern of if you're telling participants you're going to release their data out there for people to reanalyze, would this put them off? And it turns out it didn't. But one of the best findings was all it showed was people don't read the information sheet and consent form. I think it was something like they spend an average of 15 seconds reading through it. So it didn't really make any impact on their approach to doing the study, they were fine continuing with it. And then the last thing to put this, it's always brought up as like a straw man argument where, oh no, we can't share any of the data. And that's fine in certain scenarios. There is lots of examples where, for various ethical reasons, you just won't be able to share the data. But for my research, it was all based on response times. It was all cognitive tasks. So there's absolutely nothing standing in the way of me being able to share the data. I just had to make sure that the participants agreed to it. Fine. The next thing in the method stage is, if you imagine someone is interested enough in your research that they want to recreate it, or on the flip side, say you're doing your PhD, you're doing a research project and you want to adapt some really interesting article you found. Headline is, very few psychology articles do this. There's one study that was only 14% in their sample that actually shared the research materials. So in my experience, this has been very helpful for reproducibility, although I don't think I'm interested enough that anyone's actually tried to replicate one of my studies. But people have used them and adapted them for their own purposes. So for a couple of the studies from my PhD, I shared the task scripts from Open Sesame, and I know at least 2 people have used them and adapted them for their own study, because they got in touch with me and asked me a little bit of advice about how they could adapt it slightly. So this is helpful for sort of both sides. You're getting a little bit of exposure and you're helping someone with their own research. So this can be very easy. If you use scripting software like Open Sesame or PsychoPy, you can very easily share the scripts that this is based on. You can put this on the OSF, but it is really important. So one of the key tips here is you help people to use this. So you can add what's called a README file, which explains what the task does, what some of its properties are. If they want to edit it, how do they go about it? Because what might be very obvious to you after you've spent a month or so building it, someone else could open it and they've got no idea what you're actually trying to do with the task. So if you include this, it's going to be much more helpful for them understanding it, being able to reuse it. I currently work for an online university, so I use something called Gorilla now, which is an online experiment builder. And this makes it super easy for you to incorporate this open materials into your workflow. So they have this area called open materials where you can essentially publish the task you've used in your study. People can preview it. So this is an example of one of the studies from my PhD on the right. You could preview it to see how it worked for me. So, or for the participant, should I say. If you're interested and you want to adapt it, you can clone it into your own experiment. So this makes it really easy for that completely reproducible. It would be the exact same version that you had in your study. The one thing you do need to keep an eye on if there's any copyright issues. So for example, in the study I talk about here, I had images from the International Effective Picture System, and they have some guidelines where you can't openly share them because they don't want people getting habituated to them. So I had to take these out. So you have to be careful about what stimuli you include, but for most cases, there is no reason why you can't just share the materials you used. And it's either going to allow people to reproduce your research if it's interesting enough, or they can adapt it for their own task, and it's going to be increased exposure for you. So one of my favorite mistakes in terms of it being an educational experience was a bit of an adventure with the first study of my PhD. So it's a bit of a journey of transitioning from using SPSS to really relying on R. So when I first did it, I was really excited. It was the first big research project that I was doing. Process the data in Excel. So I would filter the columns, get my mean reaction time per condition, and I would copy that into SPSS for all my participants. And then a couple of months later, I was essentially making a poster for a conference, and I just started using R, and I wanted to make some really pretty graphs like on the right. And then when I was doing the processing, I wanted to double check, and it was giving me different results. So I was a little bit confused. I thought I'd done something wrong in R. So I was playing around, and it took me a few days. But what I realized was when I was processing the data in Excel, I'd essentially mixed up 2 columns for some participants. So not all of them. I had to go through the spreadsheet kind of row by row. And for around half the participants, I'd mixed up 2 columns. So I'd got them the wrong way around when I would taken it from Excel and put it into SPSS. So when I did the whole processing pipeline in R, all the effects disappeared. So I'd got to the point where I was writing it up for publication. It was the first study for my PhD. I was really excited about it. And in the figure on the right, it was the key results. I'd written it up for this conference poster, and perfect, like nice little shiny stars as well to indicate that was like the significant difference that I was predicting. But then as soon as I did all the corrections, it was like straight lines for all the groups. So all of it disappeared. So as well as it being an example of why this reproducible pipeline is really important for research, it's also a good story for how you should double check your results, even when they're consistent with what you're expecting. So I know I have a bad habit of, if something looks off, I will really dig into it, see what's going on. But here, everything was exactly as I predicted. So for those hypotheses that I later added in, but before analyzing the data, everything looked good. Everything looked like I was expecting. It was consistent with my predictions. So even then, it's really important that you go and really double check to make sure you're just not kidding yourself. Because I managed to catch this mistake when it was just writing it up for a conference poster within my PhD. But it's much better than when you've actually published it. If you have to issue correction or retract it, it's much better to catch the error when you're doing it. Second study is a bit further along with me learning R. So because I had open data, I could have this sort of reproducible workflow where I took the raw data that I got from participants into the statistical tests, into the graphs I was included in my thesis. And because I wasn't super confident in a lot of stuff in R, I wrote reproducible results section. So with our Markdown, where you can write both text and embed the statistical results in there as well. And what I would do is just export it as a PDF. So it would just be the results section. But then because I was writing my thesis in something else, in another software, I just copy and paste the text into my thesis. So it's a little bit better. Fewer mistakes than just copying things from Excel into SPSS and then transferring it to the thesis, but it's still relying on this copy and paste error, which can cause problems. Like the one my examiners noticed, where although it was reproducible and I found a problem which is very easy to fix when it came to my corrections, one of the things I'd done with the analyses here was copy and paste the graph twice. So where it should have been 2 different ones, I just had the same one. And I didn't notice it until the day before my Viva. And then when I was in my Viva, I sort of fessed up to it in my introduction and said like I'd identified a mistake and asked if they'd noticed, and both of them did. So that was just another little mistake which can sneak in there. And then again, by the time I got to the final study of my PhD, it was to a point where I was happy with this workflow. So it was open data again, so I could take it from this point of the data from the participants all the way to the graphs that you'd include in the article. A whole manuscript written in our Markdown. So this is that full pipeline of taking the data, and you've got both the words of the rest of your manuscript, and you can embed the results of your statistical tests in there. So this is if anyone uses our, this is a thing called Papaya, and it's a package made by Frederick Aust, who made the pre-registration template as well. And this really allows you to incorporate that whole analysis pipeline in and be able to capture that in the final manuscript. So building this into your workflow, there are so many ways you can do it. So like I said at the start, I'm not going to obsess too much over R, although it's my favorite thing to use. There are different ways you can do it. So if you use SPSS and you're perfectly happy with it, You can paste the syntax, you can save that. And although with both of the first two, so this and Jasper and Jamovi, well, the thing you're lacking is that analysis pipeline. So it's at the point of summary level statistics where you have where you just have the kind of like mean responses or whatever your dependent variable is going to be in your statistical test, and you don't really get that. So it's fine for the analysis choices for the statistical tests. The same thing with Jasper and Jamovi. So I put that in the next level of how excited Vince McMahon's getting, where it's much more reproducible because it's open source. So anyone can access it. Jasper and Jamovi files, when you export them, have really good property where if you upload them to the OSF, you can actually view them in the page. You don't need to download it into and open it into Jasper or Jamovi. It actually renders in HTML on the OSF page. The next level, you can share the R or Python script. So Python's fine if you use that for data analysis as well. And the one thing that I haven't got to yet, the problem with R is it updates over time. So people are constantly releasing fixes for different software packages within it. So over time, that could become irreproducible. So one of the things that I've seen different people use is this idea of like a version controlled code capture. One example being CodeOcean, where what it does is it captures it at the point of you upload your data, and it manages it to the particular version of R you used at the time. So that would be fully reproducible because it would manage the exact version you used at that point in time. If you just write it in normally in R, go back say a year later and some of the package is updated, you could run it and it could break. So this is one sort of solution to that. Second things around here, at the start talks about how one of the problems is there can be statistical inconsistencies. So there's this great software called StatCheck, providing that your results are formatted in APA style. It will tell you whether the p-value you're producing for your test statistic is consistent with the test statistic and the degrees of freedom. So it can identify potential copy and paste errors, typos when you're reporting it. All you have to do is upload a PDF and it will identify all the statistical tests that you've reported, and you can potentially catch those errors much earlier on. And if you like the idea of R, but you don't want to go the full distance and write the whole thing in R Markdown, you can try this sort of middle ground, where there's this Word plugin, an R package called Tidy Stats. And if you do your analyses in R, you can save it into a JSON file. And in Word, what you can do is take that information and report it in a reproducible way. So it helps you take that information, keep it reproducible, but you'll write it in Word, something you're potentially much more comfortable with, rather than writing the whole thing in R Markdown. Then the final thing is making sure that you can disseminate your findings. So we're talking about reproducible workflows. And the reason I talk about this as part of that is if you can't read something, you can't reproduce it. So if you're trying to find the background research for whatever research project you're working on, you read the abstract of an article that you think sounds perfect, but you get a big paywall. So although by no means am I advocating that you use Sci-Hub like we had 2 talks ago in the Riot Science Club, that would be bad. If you cannot get it, it's going to make it very difficult for you to get any useful details just from the abstract. So one of the useful things is being able to release an open access version of your research, of your thesis. So depending where you are in your career stage, you can have a pre and post print. So preprint is the version before you submit it for peer review. Postprint is the final accepted version. So once everything's gone through, many journals will allow you to share the final version that's had all the reviewers' comments addressed, but it's just still like your Word document version. So it doesn't have any of the journal formatting. You can share that for a lot of journals. So you can do this on the OSF. One of the examples here is There is part of the OSF called Thesis Commons. So this is for undergraduate, master's, PhD theses. So you can share your work there. It's great for exposure when you're an early career researcher. Like one of my dissertation students completed her undergraduate, she uploaded it on here, and she was able to send it to her now master's supervisor. So it's another way you can have exposure, particularly earlier on, but pre and post prints are going to be helpful when you're releasing manuscripts. And it's really important if you're wanting to do this, most journals will allow it, but you have to check where you can post it. So there's a Sherpa Romeo database that will tell you what the individual journal policies are for the different steps. So some journals will only allow you to share preprint, so before you send it to them. Some will only allow you to share postprint. So after the accepted version, maybe they have an embargo where they will let you a year later, but you can check there. Pretty much all the manuscripts I've worked on have been able to be available both as pre and post prints, and you can update them along that process. But one of the studies I'm working on at the moment, it feels really weird because of how I've been able to incorporate this from my PhD going forwards. It's the first time I'd experienced sending it to a journal that didn't allow preprints. It felt really weird. It felt like I was hiding something. So it's important that you check this because, if you're targeting a particular journal, it can interfere with your ability to publish there. So it is really important that your co-author is approved. Again, look at this great article about how you can explain the benefits. Say if your supervisor or co-author isn't fully on board, you can outline the benefits to them. In my own experience, I've not come across anyone who's dead set against it. It's more just inertia where they haven't done it in the past, so they don't see why they would do it in future. So if you just explain what it is, usually do it for them, especially if you're working with like a busy PI who doesn't want to do anything more than they have to do just to churn everything through. Normally, if you're doing it on their behalf, like they have no problems with it. It's just as long as it's not their responsibility. So there are different field-specific preprint servers, like for psychology, we have the PsyArchive, and there are different ones within the OSF. And then personally, although there are mixed, it's a mixed bag. I like keeping ResearchGate maintained. So there are lots of concerns about it. It's a for-profit company, I believe. So there's always a question of like how much are they profiting off the stuff you're doing. I personally like it. It's particularly important for sort of lower and middle income countries that don't have real big journal access. So I've had, for the things that I've shared, different researchers contact me just to get access to articles because they can't get it through their university library. So personally, I think it's helpful, but there are concerns about it. So that part's more up to you. And then to finish off, one of the things that I've tried to communicate here is it's this constant cycle of development. So at one point, you may be happy with how you're doing with your own workflow and how you're making it as reproducible as possible. But there's always something else you can do. So hopefully you can see that for what someone who might seem very confident with it at one point may have been in a completely different place a year or two ago. So for my own areas of development, so although I'm very happy with my approach, there are some things I could still do. And there's always mistakes you can make. There's always more you can do. So I've never used one of the code capsules. So at some point, some of the scripts I've shared might not work anymore. Some of the packages could be updated and they no longer work. One thing I haven't really talked about is Git, so version control. I've tried it and it just never really stuck. There is this great article where they outline how you can use it to manage your research assets. I really need to give it another go, but it's just never stuck for me. I find it a little bit awkward. I do see the benefit, just not got there. And I've been involved in some qualitative research. It's not really my thing. Do see the benefit of it. It's just not my primary research, but there is some great work on how you can improve your reproducibility in qualitative research. So that's something that I could learn a little bit better as well. So it's not for a lot of this work in more of like a tutorial of how you can do these individual things and where you can get more support. One of the big things for me was I didn't really have any, like none of my supervisors used any kind of open science practices. No one really I worked with at the time. So most of the things I learned was off my own back, although we did eventually get a core group of PhD students who was interested in this. Really throughout my sort of early development as a PhD student, it was more just learning off the different articles, off Twitter, that kind of thing. But now there is much more support. So we've got Reproducibility, which is a journal club to do with open science, currently in 123 institutions. So it's either one in your university, could be you're interested in setting one up. They've got a setup guide on the website that's linked to here. They also have online sessions where you could pop into if they're running something interesting. We've got the Ryan Science Club here. So there is one workshop already posted from last year that would be relevant to helping you build this reproducible workflow. So this was to do with R, covers R Markdown. There is a couple more talks in this schedule. So the next one I believe is on R Markdown. And I think there's another one on Git further down the line. Sam might be able to correct me in a minute. And then one of my favorite resources based at the University of Edinburgh, there's this thing called Coding Club, where they've got different bits of software tutorials where they've got different explanations how you can do things. So there's things with R, so using R to visualize results, how you can use R Markdown. And then there's this one on Introduction to GitHub, so the thing that I could really do better myself. So there's all these resources out there to help you. And to finish off, so it's going to be important to adopt a reproducible workflow both for you. So remember, it's all about if you're doubting if it's going to be useful to someone else, just think of the selfishness. Like you don't want to make errors. You want to catch them before they can get out into the world. It's going to help your memory as well. But you're also doing it for the community as well. So allowing someone to reproduce your work, letting them build on the stuff that you've done. Really recommend this incremental approach. So it would be very difficult and a little bit overwhelming just to completely overhaul how you've been approaching doing research. So you can add one in your current project, so something that's really easy. So for most things, if the journal allows it, you could post a preprint, and that's something that's pretty straightforward to do. And then there's other things that's going to take time to build and add it into your workflow. So using a reproducible manuscript, using preregistration in the next project that you start from the ground up. So try and take this incremental approach, and hopefully what's come through here is when I was sort of developing my own workflow through my PhD, I didn't really have much support. So although there was things out there and I could learn from, sort of my own journey was made some mistakes along the way, sort of learned from them now and at a point where I'm quite happy with it. And because it's the idea of making mistakes can be a barrier, hopefully what you can see is people do make mistakes, you can learn from them, and yeah, hopefully you'll be a better scientist because on the back of it. So thank you everyone for listening. And Sam, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. So excuse me. So I will just keep that holding slide if you like, or you can take it off, but we'll make sure that you're on the screen as opposed to flitting between my camera and yours. Yes, we do have questions. I'll just quickly respond to what you said first, though. First of all, we do have Peter Branney, who will make an appearance for the Wolverhampton Right Science Club. Let me just have a look at the date. He will pop up in March the 16th, and he will be talking about qualitative research in open science. The other talks that James referred to, Oliver Payne is on the 25th of Feb, and he will look at R Markdown and GitHub. Mm-hmm. We also have using Superpower R package to simulate power by Aaron Caldwell. on April the 15th, and Charles Driver will give a talk on data simulation in R, which is the working title, on the 26th of April. So do check out those. And as James said, we have a talk already on our YouTube channel. I should also stress that that was co-organised by the UCL branch of Reproducibility. So it was a nice collaboration between the two initiatives. So anyway, to your questions, the one here that's highly voted, which is from Anonymous, and they say, are there any guides on how to revise a manuscript in R Markdown, e.g. track changes when replying to reviewers?
Yeah, I'm not sure. So that's one of the barriers. So yeah, with my own approach, so none of my PhD supervisors ever used R. So I did it off my own back. So when I've written a manuscript, I pretty much just sent them the PDF version. So normally they would add comments to the PDF once you'd exported it from R. They could add it there. When I've worked with people in the past on this, so this is kind of where Git can come in handy, where you can sort of collaborate with people. I've never really used it very well. I've sort of copied and pasted the R Markdown script into Google Docs, and people add comments there, and then could add it in, and then you'd have to copy and paste it back into R Markdown. It's a little bit clunky. Personally, I don't know of a sort of more straightforward approach. Do you know of anything, Sam? Do you use R?
I don't use R. I mean, I don't know whether. So Ian is with us, Ian Lahart, who's co-producing today. I don't know whether Ian has anything to add. Do you know of how to answer this one, Ian?
No, I think James has done a good job. I use R Markdown as well, and that is a limitation for me as well in terms of how to revise manuscripts, track changes and so on. But having said that, I don't send my I don't necessarily do the manuscript completely in R Markdown, just because it's usually requested as a Word document by the journal. So you kind of have an R document, an R Markdown document, but you end up submitting Word anyway. So and James points out most of my collaborators use Microsoft Word as well, and not necessarily R Markdown. So until we have a larger number of people using it on the team, then I'll continue using Word. But yeah,
R Markdown doesn't really scale particularly well, I don't think. I mean, if it is that you're, in my view anyway, if you are working on a collaborative project with senior academics who are not tech savvy, to say, let alone familiar with R, I do find that Google Docs is very serviceable. You have the Zotero plugin, and you can also look for previous versions. And some of the features can be a bit clunky, but I do find that is a decent alternative if you're in a sticky situation where, where you want to try and be reproducible, but current options are between Word or R. Google Docs might be a nice halfway house. I don't know.
Yeah, it's I'm pretty sure you can export R Markdown to Word. It's just it's a little bit clunkier than with the Papaya package. It works great, exporting it to PDF, and it looks awesome. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so really in my experience when I've done it, I talked about earlier, where pretty much my niche has been that almost facilitator approach, where I normally help out on research and helping people to do it. So I normally do the heavy lifting with doing the analyses in R and writing it up that way. They would correct on the wording of it, and then I'd sort of correct it in R again. So it depends kind of what your role is in the research process.
Yeah, I just also remembered that a while ago now, Ewan Carr at King's, he did a talk solely on R Markdown, and it was really quite informative. So there may be something in there that would be of use. and I can post a link in the Q&A message board to the anonymous questioner. Next,
I think there's a reviewer. I think there's a reviewer package on OR that gives you some kind of way of tracking changes, but I haven't used it myself, so.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Another question is, I actually came across this recently, which is, I don't know whether you can answer this, James, but we're kind of used to us making the errors, or our collaborators making errors in the write-up or analysis. But errors that are introduced at the journal level are frustrating, and they particularly crop up when they do typesetting. And I was recently found out about this as well. So I'll just read this question by Anonymous first, which is: one thing that annoys me with traditional peer review is that errors can be introduced during typesetting, which the authors have to then double check. I wonder if anyone has looked into this. Historically, this has been a problem for PLOS One, and errors are not limited to text typos, nor can they be corrected, as I think PLOS One has no proofing stage. Not sure if this is the case now. And they've also put a link to a blog about it. And yeah, so what do you do in those cases where, is it just that you're just going to have to pull up your sleeves and check everything before it goes to print, or is there anything you can do to deal with those issues?
Oh, yeah, not. I guess not something I could help with directly. Yeah, it's difficult. Where it's normally just you are relying on comparing it. Yeah, it can be difficult. It's like added value, right? Like, so that's what we're getting from journals. Like, we're nicely doing it in, say, rendering it from our Markdown, and then they're sort of ruining all our hard work for a nice profit margin. Yeah, honestly, I don't really have anything. Like, it's more of just comparing the sort of what the proofs are giving you to the results you have. Yeah, I guess that's like more of a problem with the system rather than you. I guess the one benefit of having this approach of having a preprint, updating it up to the point of like the final accepted version is like your postprint. Maybe that's like the most accurate version, which isn't ideal. But you do have that kind of paper trail of this is the point where I've done it. This is the stuff I have control over, and really it's that last stage of you're almost like documenting where the error is coming into the system. In terms of correcting it, I don't really have an answer.
Yeah, it's a sticky situation. I don't know how you would tackle that. I don't know whether Ian has anything to add as well before I go on to a question that I'd like answered, actually.
No, nothing to add to James there.
All right, cheers, Ian. Yeah, so I have a couple of questions, James. They're kind of a two-parter, so I'll try and be short. But I'm fortunate enough to have made that sort of transition from being an insecure postdoc to someone with a permanent lecturing position now. And what I have found is that I'm increasingly trying to incorporate open science practices is in teaching and the curriculum development. And I'm sure you have been involved with that both at Coventry and at Arden as well. And I wonder whether there is any kind of things that you would suggest or recommend as kind of first steps to this new crop of lecturers that will be experienced in open science, but only in terms of its application in research. What about teaching and lecturing? So that's the first part. I'll wait until you've answered to ask the second.
Yeah, no, to be fair, I found it's a lot just everyone's always scared of including it because they think it's going to be students going to find it difficult. I guess it depends where you insert it. Where I've had dissertation students in the past so I teach research methods at level 4, so first year of undergraduate, and on our MSc conversion. So the MSc conversion is much easier because it's the first module, I have control over it, so I can include different things in that and introduce them from the very start. When it comes to undergraduate dissertations, they could add different people teaching them with different, with like a different focus. In my experience, like most people get on with it fine if they included them. Like students love the idea of pre-registration. If you explain, and it's always like a fun exercise where you explain lots of these things to them at the start, and it's almost at that point where before they're all really jaded and sort of institutionalized by the system, where you explain like pre-registration and sharing your data, and they go, yeah, obviously. And it's really harder after. So students like the idea of pre-registration. So for most of my dissertation students, they've done that fine. So I normally give them, say, like the template. I show them an example of one of mine, and within like a revision, it's usually pretty good. I haven't managed to do it here, but for example, with some of the, let's call it more technologically advanced stuff. So when I talked about R Markdown, I've not used that where I'm based because I still have to use SPSS. I haven't managed to convince them to change yet, but then there's places like Glasgow, which is completely changed to using R. So some of those stuff that they get their students doing by like the second year of their undergraduate is like witchcraft, where they are much more comfortable and they are absolutely fine with it. So yeah, I guess it's really just when you introduce them to it, like here, this incremental approach where you can outline the easy things they can do, and then work people up to the more difficult things that are a little bit more time sensitive, like thinking about the ethics, thinking about how you can write it up in a more reproducible way.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jack. I think my experience has been the same. I think pushing the sort of selfish reasons why you would want to learn this from an undergraduate perspective, you know, regardless of whether you are going to go into academia or in industry, to get a good foundational understanding of what you can do to make your research more reproducible just saves a lot of time and avoids a lot of stress. You don't have to mess around trying to remember, as you found out, how to do even if it's simple as doing a power analysis, which could take, you know, even all day to try and do it, and that could be the difference between meeting a deadline and not. One thing I just want to quickly ask, and I know that we've gone past the hour and we said it would just be an hour, but James is happy to stay for a few more minutes, so if you do have any questions, do feel free to ask them. The one question is with ethics. So I sit on an ethics committee, and do you have any experience in sitting on one? And if so, how have you tried to incorporate sort of open science, reproducible practices that way?
So straight answered, no, I've not sat on one. Yeah, my only experience has been at the point of being like a dissertation supervisor. So yeah, I've not influenced it that way. I've talked about open science. I'm doing like we have like a little research and teaching pedagogy group at Arden, because it's not a research focused university, so very few are active researchers. So I'm talking about including open science in teaching in a couple of weeks actually. But yeah, like most of the points, like it's more from just the planning stage of being someone's dissertation supervisor, like encouraging them to do a power analysis, helping them with that, getting them to pre-register their study, helping them with that. I've never looked at it from like the other side. So maybe your input is more important here. So if you've sat on this, what can you do from that almost more institutional side?
Yeah, I mean, there's a distinction, isn't there, between how you have complied with the ethical standards versus what is best practice in research. They're not always aligned. But I think definitely you can make definite improvements to power analysis and justification. Are you unnecessarily testing an excess amount of people or not enough people, and considering the ethical implications if it is a false positive finding? I think you can make a solid argument there. just for a start. And I know that, of course, this will be really central to your sort of ref environment statement. You know, if you are supporting this kind of reproducible research. I don't know whether, Ian, again, whether you wanted to add anything to that or ask any final questions to James before we wrap up.
The only thing I'd add is that I think the ethics provides a great opportunity to introduce some of these open science practices, because, you know, the ethics application is pretty much a pre-registration.
Yeah.
You know, in terms of, you can bring in best practices of pre-registration into the ethics application. I think a lot of the issues is I want to say policing is probably a strong word, but just checking whether authors have done what they said they were going to do in the first place. So, you know, there should be consistency between the ethics application and, you know, the pre-registration and then the end publication. And it's just, you know, the discrepancies there and making sure that they're, you know, declared in the final publication. So a lot of it is around transparency. So, you know, we introduced that in education. So we emphasize transparency, the ethics application, you know, pre-registration. I think those are really easy and important things that we can introduce into undergrad education. I suppose my final question would be, if James could talk a little bit around how he uses data simulations to inform his analysis plans. I'd like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that's one thing that took me a while to get the hang of, and it becomes more important when you've got essentially anything more than like a t-test, where if you've got more than two groups, more than two conditions, there's going to be much more comparisons than you can accurately look at. So what you can do, there's some really interesting papers, like there's one on how you can, Lisa De Bruyne and Dale Barr from Glasgow, they've got a paper on simulating data for mixed effects models. So pretty much anything a little bit more complicated, have to do it like that. It's difficult. Like it's probably one of the hardest skills I've done and learn. But yeah, it's more about just, and that's where trying to collect thoughts. Yeah, it's where you've got to have like more knowledge of how you're approaching your topic, about what the expected values are, what the properties are. So if you imagine like the classic approach para-analysis, just like what did Cohen say? What if I put a Cohen's D of 0.5 in, what sample size is it giving me? Whereas the simulation approach, it's more about the sort of one step low, where it's for my particular measure, what would be the mean and standard deviation be for each of the groups? For within subject effects, what would you'd need to have like the correlation? So it's a difficult skill. In a lot of articles, they don't actually provide enough information that you would be able to have make like an informed like simulation. So it can be difficult, but it's yeah, I do yeah, for the thought about this, I've so for a plug, tomorrow doing the para-analysis workshop at Wolverhampton, and as part of that I've got some resources on data simulation. I just haven't got it prepared here. I don't know if we can put it in the link, Sam, like if we've got a link. It caught me off guard with the question with that one.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's up to Manpower because he's organising it. I don't know whether it's internal only, but we can make sure to circulate it amongst our mailing list. And
yeah, the workshop itself, I think, I've got like for the workshop, I've got like a references and annotated bibliography.
Oh yeah, we can circulate that everywhere. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, question caught me off guard. Like I wasn't that prepared for it.
Apologies, James.
No, it's okay.
You did well.
Journalists asking me tough questions. Yeah, I guess like to finish off, like I'm more than happy, like sort of outline the areas of support, But if anyone wants to get in touch, like my sort of Twitter details are on the start and in the advert. And yeah, thanks everyone's time.
Well, thank you very much, James. That was brilliant talk and really nice, sort of not just basic, but the personal touch is something that is actually quite missing, I think, from a lot of the talks that are touch on this subject of reproducible workflows. And it is really good. I mean, it kind of reminds me of Kirsty Whitaker's saying, which is borrowed from Tesco, which is every little helps. And it's nice to see that you have made those sort of baby steps and to see that journey. So I think that's really been informative for a lot of people who do find this new way of practicing research quite daunting. So I'm going to do a quick wrap up. So everybody can see me now. So thank you, everybody. This has been a wonderful launch of the new Riots Club. There are lots of us now. We have one last week was Imperial. They set up their own Riots Club led by Nadia Solomon. So please check out that talk when it goes posted on our OSF page. Our next talk will be on the 19th of Feb by Caitlin Warner, who's an ambassador for the OSF, and she will be talking about pre-registration and registered reports. So it's been a nice complementary talk to James's today. And then the one after that will be, again, very, very germane. So it's R Markdown and GitHub, a walkthrough for sharing code and results, and that will be hosted at our Rotterdam site. We also have other sites as well, such as the University of Exeter. If you want to join our mailing list, please email us at riotscienceclub@kcl.ac.uk. And if you need information to set up your own site, we'll be more than happy to help you and get you on your way. So thank you again, James, and thank you, Ian, and thank you, Manpal, who is here in spirit, I'm sure, for organising today. And until next time, I suppose, enjoy the rest of your week.
Yeah, thanks for organising, Sam.